We're proud to say that, we represent anywhere from a third to a half of the global market. And the global market's, depending on how you add it up, it's about a $60 billion market. And again, the origin of a third to a half of that comes from companies that are represented in the Orthopedic Capital in Warsaw.
Welcome to Off the Record, a podcast featuring leaders on IBJ Media's Indiana 250 list. I'm Nate Feltman, CEO of IBJ Media, which publishes the Indiana 250, a list of the most influential business people in the state. Today, I'm joined by Bob Vitoux, the CEO of OrthoWorx, an organization in Northeast Indiana charged with helping the city of Warsaw and Kosciuszko County retain the title Orthopedic Capital of the World. The orthopedic industry in Warsaw go way back to the late 1800s when the first orthopedics manufacturer in the world was started there. Warsaw and surrounding communities still produce more than half of the world's orthopedics products, and it's Bob Vitoux's job to make sure the Warsaw area is positioned to stay at the top of the industry. He seems well positioned to do just that. Bob is a native Hoosier, a graduate of Manchester University, and a veteran of 3 of Indiana's orthopedics heavyweights, Zimmer, Biomet, and DePuy. Bob served in finance and management positions at all 3 of those companies, but he hasn't spent his entire career in Indiana or in the orthopedics industry. He's worked in public accounting, private equity, tool manufacturing, and other industries. Bob spent 2 years as CFO of Steinway Musical Instruments in New York City, and also spent time in Scotland working for LifeScan, a medical diagnostics company owned by Johnson & Johnson. Most recently, he was a CFO and Chief Commercial Officer at Dovetail Brands, a collection of companies that make high-end products for luxury homes. Dovetail is a holding of Fort Wayne-based private equity firm Ambassador Enterprises, where Bob spent 3 years as vice president. By the time Bob was tapped to lead OrthoWorx in July of 2022, he had more than 25 years of experience at orthopedic companies and a deep knowledge of the industry's roots in Warsaw and Kosciuszko County. He just rotated off the board of Grace College and Seminary in Kosciuszko County and is on the Northeast Indiana Elevate Ventures Board, which funds and advises entrepreneurs in an 11-county area in the northeast part of the state. Here's our conversation. Bob, welcome to Off the Record Podcast. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So, Bob, you grew up in a small town in northwest part of the state and studied accounting. What was your first job in the orthopedics industry? And is that how you found out about Warsaw being such a specialization in orthopedics over the years, or were you aware of that growing up?
It really wasn't. I grew up in Northwest Indiana, Nate, and grew up in the farmlands and really didn't know a whole lot outside of the area that I grew up, and ended up in public accounting coming out of Manchester, and I think we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later. And Zimmer was actually one of my clients at the time. So I got the opportunity to go down and do some audit work. And through that journey, got the insight into what the Orthopedic Capital was all about.
For our listeners who are maybe not as familiar with the story of Warsaw, Indiana, and how it became the orthopedic capital of the world, you might know a little bit about that history, and maybe you can share why it has become the orthopedic capital of the world and why it's such an important area of emphasis economically for our state.
I could go on and on. I promise to keep it short, but the short version is back in the late 1800s, as you indicated in the opening, Reverend DePuy was traveling through the Warsaw area, and as the story goes, his wagon broke down. And so he needed to get the wagon repaired, and as the story goes on, it supposedly and presumably, he fell in love with the sheriff's daughter. And what makes that story really interesting is his age was about 2x her age. She was still in her teens, and again, you can do the math of what that put him at. But we all joke and say it was quite interesting that he fell in love with the sheriff's daughter at such a young age. But that ended up being really, really important. As it turned out, the first products that DePuy was known for were the wood splints that they made. And at the time, there were a lot of, I'm suspecting, farming accidents and things of that nature. And that really led to the manufacturing of wood splints right there in Warsaw, Indiana.
When was the time frame when the wood eventually turned to metal and metal began to be used?
So Rever got going in 1895, and then he had a salesman by the name of J.O. Zimmer, and you might recognize that name, right? But J.O. actually ended up founding his company in 1934, Zimmer, which is now known as Zimmer Biomet. But as the story goes, as I indicated, he was older than his wife, Rever was, and so Rever passed early. And so J.O. purportedly went to Revra's wife, and she was running the company at the time, which is really remarkable. You think about the fact that in the early 1900s, you had a female leading a business, which, great. She was blazing trails. But she wouldn't sell the business to J.O., so he was the one that I think really led a lot of that charge to move to a different material along the way. Revra, was gone, but I think Depew and Zimmer were off to the races of competing with one another.
It's amazing how these stories, often you hear how a place in a location becomes so specialized in a particular area. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that's how Biomet started as well. So a former employee leaves. I don't know if they get upset or if they decide, hey, I can do this on my own. But, it's amazing when you look at Silicon Valley that there's a similar story of people deciding they're going to start their own thing, leave one of these big companies. And I think that sort of happened in Warsaw.
It sure has. And the gentleman that you, I think, refer to that often gets brought up is Dane Miller. There were actually 4 founders for Biomet, but Dane was he was pretty outspoken of the reason why he left Zimmer at the time. He just said it had become too big and too slow for his liking, and he and the other 3 founders and their wives ended up founding Biomet.
Yeah, it's a great story. And you're right. That's who I was thinking about. So my understanding is that there may have been some orthopedic industry executives that have had a big or maybe outsized influence on you. Maybe you could talk a little bit about some of who your mentors have been as you've spent more time in the industry.
One of them is again Dane, and I would tell you the book that sits on my credenza is the Maverick CEO book with Dane on the front page of that. And I competed against Dane. I was with Zimmer on a couple of occasions, and then was with Depew, and then eventually finally found myself landing at Biomet as it went private through some of Dane's maneuvering. But Dane was just a remarkable man. He did so many things for the industry, just pioneered a lot of technology. But the thing that really sticks in my mind is just how community oriented Dane was, and how committed he was to making sure that he gave back. We're still fortunate to this day. His widow, Mary Louise, still resides in the Winona Lake area. We lost Dane, unfortunately, back in 2015, and that was way, way too early to lose someone of his caliber. But his legacy lives on, along with several others. I'll leave out names if I try to name them all, but it's been just a really, really incredible journey to be a part of an industry that really gives people quality of life back and impacts their lives in such positive ways. And then to know that there have been leaders, like Dane and so many others that we stand on the shoulders of.
Absolutely. And Dane, I know, not only contributed locally, but he was engaged on a statewide basis too. He was a founding board member of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation that Mitch Daniels asked to be there right at the beginning when that corporation was formed. And I was fortunate enough to work alongside Dane, and he always had great comments and ability to help us think about our strategy and grow economically.
I remember Dane and I actually served on a nonprofit together, and Dane was instrumental in the annual fundraiser of significance was a Crazy Waiter Night, and he would literally prepare the meal on his own for 175 people, and he'd be in the back of the restaurant that we would have, and he'd just be sweating up a storm. But there was just never a prouder moment than to be alongside of Dane and to know that what he believed in and he was passionate around. And there are a lot of stories like that. Dane and Mary Louise have been, again, like I say, very instrumental and continue to have impact. But there are a lot of folks, over the years that have also had their influence. But I do think that Mitch Daniels, the story I heard was when he went to Purdue, I believe that the first phone call that he made was to Dane.
That would not surprise me at all. Well, talking a little bit more about the cluster that's developed in Warsaw, I know in recent years, some of the companies have changed hands and there have been mergers and acquisitions. And as part of that, I know certainly at the state level and I'm sure locally, there's been a feeling of, oh gosh, we certainly don't want this slipping away, this orthopedic capital of the world to somehow slip away and anyway mitigate the incredible impact it's had in Warsaw and beyond. Tell us a little bit about those crosswinds to the extent there have been and the recent effort to create OrthoWorx. It's not that recent. It happened, I know, back maybe close to 15 years ago or so, but talk a little bit about that potential scare and what we're doing now with OrthoWorx.
I think as things get bigger, bigger isn't always better. Sometimes it can be, but I think that, just like the story of Dane, branching off and building Biomed, I think that there's always been rumblings that, this organization's going to do that, or that the parent of this organization is going to do something different. But the innovation side of what goes on in and around the Orthopedic Capital is phenomenal. So you just see these new companies that are spawned time and time again, and what really comes out of that is innovation. And I do think that there are several of us that want to make sure that the Orthopedic Capital continues to live for generations to come. That's really our tagline. And back in 2009 is when we actually were formed officially from an OrthoWorx perspective. But, it was a year and a half in the making. And I find myself now in the seat inside the organization. And I was fortunate to be at the table when this was conceived. And OrthoWorx really was a replication in a lot of ways of what BioCrossroads had represented to the life science industry. And we had some local leaders that said, hey, we want to be like that. And I think, again, the whole thought process was employees of companies get up every day, they put their jersey on for the company they serve. But there were very few people that really got up every day thinking about the industry. And again, I go back and say, Dane was one of those rare types that I think he really kept the industry in mind. But that was the goal. I think Lilly Endowment saw the opportunity to come in and be a lead financer of OrthoWorx getting off the ground. As a matter of fact, they issued a $7 million check to get OrthoWorx started. And it's been a 15-ish year journey, some years better than others. And COVID certainly had its moments on OrthoWorx as well as our industry. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit. But back to what was the root, the thought was, let's get an organization that gets up every day thinking about how they can convene the industry in some fashion, cause there to be some collaboration. And then the other thing I think we bring to the party is catalytic thinking. And, sometimes that can be fuel and sometimes that can be, honey, but it's trying to build that bridge.
The last number I saw in terms of the number of jobs tied to the orthopedics industry, I think just in maybe it's a little beyond Kosciuszko County, but I saw 22,000. Does that number seem about right for the region?
I think that's still in the ballpark, Nate. And, it certainly changed in the last couple of years as to, how many people show up or come to Warsaw every day. We've got remote working that's more prevalent, but you don't make implants if you don't show up. So we have just a tremendous workforce across the industry that's there every day making these highly engineered metal and plastic implants.
So your job at OrthoWorx is to not only maintain what we have as a state and as a region and Warsaw and the county and beyond, but hopefully to grow it too. And tell me what the first couple of years, you've been in the role now for a couple of years. Tell me how that's going and kind of how you would say, here's some of the things we've done to try to just do that, try to retain and grow our jobs in this industry.
I'll say this. I don't know that I necessarily knew exactly what I got myself into. When I arrived, it became a little clearer that, again, COVID had its impact on the orthopedic business, but also on OrthoWorx in particular. We were down to just one employee on the roster when I arrived, and Lilly Endowment, again, had stepped back up to the table and provided us with another 3-year grant for some runway. And so I was fortunate to be the finalist, to be selected to come into the organization. And our goal remains similar to what the board had decided at that time. And it was around the fact that for the first dozen years or so, we had really tried to, what we would say, hook the whale. So, back when, Biomet was on its own, it was Zimmer, Biomet, and DePuy. Those were the big whales that we were trying to hook. And from time to time, we would have their attention, but then we'd lose it or there'd be some distractions. And so what we went back to Lilly Endowment with an idea of is we really wanted to start to focus more on I'm going to call it the small to mid-size and up and coming companies. And that seemed to resonate with the folks at Lilly Endowment. Now, we said that we were not going to forget about the whales. Zimmer had now become Zimmer Biomet and DePuy was still in our midst as well. But I think what we've done in the last year and a half is we've rebuilt the roster, and so we have a handful of folks on the team at this point. We're focused predominantly on the same thing still. We say it a little differently, and I think hopefully we've got a little more action around what we do. But it's talent first and foremost, and that's equipping the next generation is the way we think about it. And then it's community. Enriching the community is the way that we like to describe that. And then last is innovation. And we like to think about that as accelerating the industry with innovation. And so, again, OrthoWorx has had a really interesting journey over the 15 years. As I said, I was at the table when we conceived it. David Johnson was instrumental from the BioCrossroads CICP seat in helping us get it going. But there were a lot of very influential orthopedic leaders at that time as well around the table. And many of them have stayed the journey, and some of them have gone on.
So the legislature not too long ago approved some funds, $30 million, if I remember correctly, to help make sure this industry grows, thrives, and to think about what's needed in that effort. Is my understanding some of those funds will start becoming available to OrthoWorx to deploy in the fairly near future. Tell us a little bit about that funding opportunity and how that came about.
I'll give credit where credit's due. Our state rep, Craig Snow, has just done a remarkable job in his first 3 years down here. And he often refers to his role as really coming down here and with a lightning rod to try and stir some things up. And I think what he came down with the message of is that we've got this industry that it's 125 years old, and there were communities that were gnawing at it. And I think Rep Snow got some people's attention. I think Senator Mishler also has been really, really formidable in what's gone on. But we were fortunate last May to learn that, as you have indicated, that a line item had been put in the coming fiscal year 25 budget. It's labeled the Orthopedic Industry Retention Initiative. And on the surface, it's pretty simple. It's for talent attraction and orthopedic industry retention. Some people describe that as really broad. I'd say it can be narrow as well, but the main focus with that $30 million was to really put money into the community that is the capital of the world as it relates to orthopedics. And Rep Snow used Medtronic. I think maybe you're aware of the Medtronic situation. Medtronic, shortly after Rep Snow was down here stirring the pot, announced that they were going to relocate a major portion of their operations, largely to Costa Rica. As Rep Snow said, never let a good crisis go to waste. And he immediately, I think, rang the governor and said, this is what I was telling you about. And I think that was, again, a catalyst for this $30 million to come to be, that we've been working really, really hard since last May to try and figure out how we're going to plant those seeds.
Have you started making any decisions about how the dollars will be invested?
We have a walking around document, as we call it, and we've got about a dozen projects that we think would be really important to continue to attract the talent that we desire. First and foremost, housing has been a challenge for us, and so having affordable workforce housing is something that we're very focused on. So we have 3 projects that would provide us about 220 units of housing. We also have a pot that we've earmarked amenities and experiences. And so our goal there really is to enlist the county, and that is to put a matching grant process in place so that all across the county, they can come and ask for matching dollars. And again, the goal would be to create spaces. We're fortunate. We have over 100 lakes in our county, so we've got a pretty nice natural resource. But, there are park opportunities, there are more trail opportunities, restaurant opportunities, just a plethora of things that would bring this next generation of workers into our community.
Yeah, it's exciting. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the statewide READY grant program that the governor and the legislature approved and is deploying those funds now. But it's really the match that often is a multiple of the actual amount approved. I mean, the philanthropic and the community match, even on private investment side, it sounds like you're working to try to leverage in a similar way $30 million allotment that will come over time to match and to just accelerate the investments.
Yeah, you're right on. And I think when Rep Snow gathered us all together last May, and I remember, we learned about it on Friday. It was finalized, and on Monday night we were all together as a gathering of community leaders. And he said, we got 30, but our goal is to turn that into 300. And that was kind of a minimum number that we put out there as a multiple of 10 that we turn that 30 into. So I don't think that we see any one project that we're going to necessarily fund in its entirety in all likelihood. We'll again use this as seed money that we can then capital stack or build from for the projects that we see.
I'll just second the effort to try to think about the amenities that'll attract the talent. I mean, that's what, we have this Engage Indiana series around the state, and we hear again and again and again, and a lot of economists now are talking about this nationally, that if you want the talent, you have to have the amenities, you have to have the kinds of experiences that talented people want and places they want to live. I know from growing up in northern Indiana that your neck of the woods is incredible with the lakes and the outdoor activities, and both winter and summer are amazing. So to think about how you can get the word out and actually invest in more amenities, I think you have a great chance of improving the workforce and in terms of the number of people that want to come and live there.
I think that's right on. And, it's interesting. The summertime, we don't have any problem, attracting folks. I think the wintertime, it can be a little cabin feverish and, people do get away from the gray days. But you may have said this, I believe, in a meeting we were in or an event we were in last week. It's interesting to watch this generation. It used to be you chose a location because that's where your job was going to be. And now I think this generation, you indicated, they pick where they want to live based upon the experiences that they're going to have, and then they figure out the job thereafter.
Let's take a quick break. This is Off the Record Podcast.
Get caught up on the state's top business news every business day with the Inside Indiana Business Radio On Demand podcast. Available now at InsideIndianaBusiness.com, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to Off the Record Podcast. I'm Nate Feltman, CEO of IBJ Media. And I'm talking with Bob Vitoux, CEO of OrthoWorx. Well, you scored, and Warsaw scored a big victory earlier this year when a Silicon Valley organization called Plug and Play opened an office in Warsaw, which is now one of, I think, 50 Plug and Play locations around the world. Tell us what Plug and Play is all about and how that might work to Warsaw's advantage.
Well, once again, credit where credit's due. The Northeast Indiana Regional Partnership were the ones that actually made that first connection. And so, as we like to say, they threw the line in the water and got the nibble, and then we helped them to reel it in. Plug and Play, as you indicated, Silicon-based organization, and they're actually up over 60, probably approaching 70 of these hub sites that they have now around the world. And it really got going in the Silicon Valley area with the founder. And he tells the story way better than I'll be able to tell it. But essentially, what I think he's come to realize is he bought a piece of real estate and was fortunate to bring some startup organizations, one of those being PayPal. He tells the story about how he took their rent and took a little bit of cash in, but then took some in-kind exchange for ownership into PayPal. And I think if I remember the numbers right, and he says these publicly, so I'm not telling his story, without him knowing it, but $100,000 turned into $7 million. But the most important thing is he got to see how these startup organizations working around one another could really build off of the momentum that each of them had and learn from what each other were doing. And so he tells the story that he eventually bought a bigger building so that he could house more startups. And then he took that secret sauce, if you will, and took that on the road. And so these hub sites, again, scattered all over the world, it's been more predominantly focused abroad than U.S. And I think that the gentleman's name is Saeed. Saeed is in the midst of trying to true that up a little bit. And so Warsaw, through the regional partnerships, Courtship, was a location that Saeed and his team became very enchanted by when they came into the community and saw the concentration of orthopedics that was represented there. They also, I think, were pretty intrigued by the state of the industry. The industry is at an inflection point with COVID moving a lot of these procedures from hospitals to surgery centers and requiring a different way in which that market gets served for innovation. So I think that the combination of all those things, the stars really aligned. And we had a ribbon cutting about 6-8 weeks ago and had, the good fortune of Governor Holcomb and Secretary Rosenberg and Saeed, the CEO of Plug and Play, and Yvonne Tornos, Zimmer Biomet CEO, was on site as well. Zimmer Biomet has really led the effort locally from the industry perspective.
Sounds like a good opportunity to continue finding ways to innovate and grow. Speaking of innovation, when we think about the medical device industry and the orthopedic industry, we sometimes think of big universities, IU, Purdue, Notre Dame, and all the research that's going on at some of the R1 research universities here in the state. But I know you're a big supporter of smaller schools and what they can bring to the table. And I know you spent a lot of years, 15 years, on the board of Grace College. How do colleges like Grace and other small schools support what OrthoWorx is trying to accomplish, especially when it comes to the talent side?
I think it maybe goes back to my phrase earlier that, bigger isn't always better. And I do think that there are benefits. Our large schools in the state of Indiana are phenomenal, but our small schools also have some pretty unique specialties in which they serve. And Grace College is an organization that just year after year puts out an incredible alumni base of students. Their main, focus historically is, they were a seminary school first, but they've really been instrumental in pre-med education as well as elementary education. But more recently, they've really gotten in the scene of business. And so I think if I think about Grace College and compare, Grace College to some of our other Northeast Indiana smaller schools, there are a lot of really small but mighty schools that do some remarkable things. And that's probably in life. If you dig back or, peel back the onion enough, you often can find something maybe a little different than maybe what people see on the outside.
Thinking about where this industry is headed, I read that hip and knee replacements are projected to grow from about 2.8 million procedures per year to 4.5 million. Not quite double, but it might be close to double by the year 2030. When you think about the opportunity for Indiana, for Warsaw, for the region around Warsaw, how much of that growth and in terms of economics and jobs and capital investment do you think can occur in Warsaw, in the region, and the state as a whole?
I think we're going to drive it. We're proud to say that, we represent anywhere from a third to a half of the global market. And the global markets, depending on how you add it up, it's about a $60 billion market. And again, the origin of a third to a half of that comes from companies that are represented in the Orthopedic Capital in Warsaw. I think the big thing that's going to continue to evolve is technology. And I alluded to the movement from hospitals to surgery centers during COVID. We've been largely a recession-proof industry for as long as I've been around, and that's 30 plus years. And during COVID, that was the first time that I think that our boat got rocked. Elective procedures got sidelined, and then surgery centers really have stepped in the place of some of these hospitals. And so if you think about a surgery center just physically, you can see that it's a much smaller footprint. So as a result, we find an industry needing to reinvent itself as to how they serve that marketplace. And I think the other thing that really is encouraging is we're starting to see, because of the advances of materials that have really allowed implants to last longer for patients, we see earlier intervention that's happening. We see younger patients that are having these procedures done to remain active. And so as a result, I think that those numbers, they're right on. I don't think that there's a cure that anybody has found for osteoarthritis anywhere on the horizon. We're doing a lot of really creative things that continue to find the good stuff in the body and utilizing that effectively. But as far as implant procedures, we're going to see them rise. We're going to see them done differently. And back on the technology front, I think with all the data that's available today, we're able to predict more easily what are the implants that are going to be used. And that allows the surgeon to be more efficient in what they do, and it helps the entire system to be more efficient.
Yeah, it's amazing how quickly now people get up and move and are back active after they've had a procedure. And the more people hear about just how easy it is, and of course there's always rehab and different things, but it's amazing how quickly people are back at it after they have a procedure.
It truly is. I remember when I started in the industry, Nate, it was Monday procedures, patients went home on Thursday. And on Tuesday procedures, they went home on Friday. And at that time, literally about 70% of the procedures were done on those 2 days of the week. And as a finance guy, it drove me crazy because that meant that our inventory and instruments weren't being utilized the rest of the week. But I think that, again, that's where we're going to really continue to see demand to continue to rise. The baby boomers are at an age where they've been active and their joints are ready for some replacement.
Well, it's exciting for opportunity for Indiana and for the region to continue to grow. Well, I know you've not just had experiences in the orthopedic industry, but as I indicated in the opening, you worked for Johnson & Johnson in Scotland and for the famous Steinway musical instrument company in New York. What did you take away from those experiences that might help you today in what you're doing at OrthoWorx?
Well, I take a lot of grief. First of all, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, I've had people ask me, are you chasing something or are you running from something? And I don't think I'm running from anything, but I certainly probably have chased a career. But I also have found that business, wildly different in the way of products, it's often done very similarly. And even, the move from Biomet to Manhattan to Steinway, that business was conducted in a very, very similar manner, the way that the products were sold and the way that we went to market. So I've found the application to be fairly reasonable. And again, starting in public accounting, I think you have a tendency to think you probably know more than you do. At least that was me. I think when I took my first job at Zimmer after coming out of public accounting, I thought I could have done anything, but I was pretty quickly humbled with the first budget process. But long answer with regard to the things I've learned is, business it can be challenging, but it can also be simplified down to just the way in which you go about doing business. And the simplest thing is, just thinking about what you can do to serve the need at hand.
I'm curious, what kept bringing you back to Indiana, having those types of experiences in New York City and then, overseas in Scotland. What was it that you said, I'm going to get back to Indiana and I want to be in Indiana for most of your career?
I'm smiling big just from a standpoint that I think about my wife is the one that reminds me, that I won't tell the long version of the joke, but the person on the rooftop and the floodwaters are rising and they send a boat and a helicopter and eventually the person dies and goes to heaven. And first thing he asks the Lord is, why didn't you save me? He said, well, I sent you a helicopter and a boat and everything else. And my wife has often said the same thing about us coming back to Warsaw. She's like, have you not figured out where you're supposed to be yet? And there's a lot of truth to that. The analogy I would use is, orthopedics is an awful lot like farming. And I grew up in the rural communities of Northwest Indiana, and farming's in my blood. And I think that that's very similar with orthopedics. Once you know that you are involved with something where you're changing the quality of life for your patients, there's something really special about that. And that's what's, continued to be the draw back over and over again. And I was an athlete, growing up, and as many stripes as you could put on your letter jacket, and so maybe as many logos as I can put on my my resume.
Well, it has to be rewarding knowing, all employees that are in this industry, knowing that the work you're doing is going to end up in somebody's body and they're relying on that to have a better quality of life. So it has to be rewarding work, no doubt. Well, you referenced this a little bit in one of your previous answers, but I know that when you think about how you lead and you think of it in terms of being a servant leader, where did you develop that approach to leadership and why is that important to you?
The person that I think of first and foremost is my father. And my father's been gone for almost 35 years, but there's not a day that goes by, Nate, that I don't think about the values that my dad instilled in me, along with my mom. But my dad was just a really simple guy, not highly educated, got his GED, high school diploma in the armed service, as a matter of fact. But I watched the way that my dad treated people. I watched the way in which he operated in a manufacturing environment. I was fortunate at that time. You're a lawyer, so maybe you'll appreciate this. But back then, you could walk around in a factory and not be bothered. There was some OSHA incident, and my dad was really apt to take me out on Sunday night and see how the plant was starting. And he worked a lot of third shift growing up, or when he was coming through the ranks, and he never lost sight of the fact that third shift often doesn't see management. And so that's really the servant aspect of what I've tried to bring to the workplace wherever I've been. Sometimes I think, my heart gets in the way of really hard decisions, and I try not to let that be an Achilles heel. But I think if you approach every day with the mindset that you really want to serve others while serving, whatever market is, I just think it makes for a fun time, first of all, but I do think that those ends do meet.
Well, Bob, we've made it to Off the Record Speed Round, where I ask you some questions and you try to give me quick answers. Some people do better than others, so we'll see how long your answers are. But I'll move ahead. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, your favorite movie?
You know me by now. I'm not short. August Rush. And if you haven't seen that movie, it's about a musical prodigy that Didn't know that his parents were musically inclined. It was filmed in New York. That's probably a special thing for me. But Robin Williams played a really dark role in that movie, and I just thought it was really, really well done. I've probably watched that at least 25 times with my daughter on the couch. It was our favorite go-to movie.
I've got a new movie to watch. Your favorite place to vacation?
Anywhere there is a really good golf course.
Favorite musical artist?
I go two ways there. I love country music. So, just this weekend, George Strait was in town and would have loved to have been at that. So George Strait on the country side, and then a little bit unique in that Neil Diamond has always just been somebody that really captured me.
They're coming to America.
Yeah, exactly.
One of my favorite songs, Neil Diamond. Favorite sport to watch?
My wife would tell you she thinks that I actually watch as much of it as I think I do, but golf. She says you sleep more than you actually watch it.
What is the first thing you do in the morning?
Put my contacts in so I can actually see what I'm doing.
Title of the last book you read?
The Coddling of the American Mind is a recent book. And if you haven't read it or the listeners haven't read it, it's maybe not for everybody, but I think it does have application. And if you have staying power, I think you'll appreciate having read it. It's a New York Times bestseller.
What food can you not live without?
Probably butter pecan ice cream.
Scotland or New York?
That's a really tough one. I would tell you the memory with New York is it was a lot of work, and it was all bright, new, and shiny. So, very attractive for me as an extrovert to meet strangers and learn a business. But Scotland was super special. And again, I refer to my wife a lot. She often says that I never saw the job description, only the location because of my addiction to golf. I would say probably I would lean to Scotland. And that's definitely the one that I think I'd go back to.
Best advice you ever received?
My dad was full of things, but never make the same mistake twice, but never be afraid to make a mistake.
Staying on the advice side, advice for a young person who wants to become a leader.
Leadership can be really, really simple, or it can be challenging for folks that want to make it challenging. But I think just constantly working hard, but not just to work hard, but work smart. And then I think always being willing to learn. When you become a knower, I think you're done. So to be a learner and be a grower, that's probably my biggest advice.
Great advice on both fronts. Well, Bob, thank you so much for joining me on the Indiana 250 podcast. Thanks for all the work that you're doing on behalf of the orthopedic sector, an incredibly important industry for that region of our state and for the state as a whole. So thanks once again for joining me, Bob.
Thanks for having me. And I just want to say, thank you to you and your team, and congratulations, by the way, of, sole ownership now of the IBJ. It's just been really fun for me in the last year and a half to get closer into what it is that you all do and what you report on. And I just think the state has so much going for it. So it's going to be exciting to look in the rear view, but it's really exciting right now to look out the windshield and see where we're going. I'm going to steal a phrase from Governor Holcomb a few weeks back at the ribbon cutting. He said, we've been known as a flyover state. And he said, fly over at your own peril at this juncture. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You just see what's happening all around the greater Indianapolis area. And we're really, really grateful to be now in the action from up north. I think that we've long thought that we could have a little more to do. And I think there are a lot of us that are really trying to make sure that we don't get forgotten. So thank you for including us.
Absolutely. And well said. And again, great to spend time with you today, Bob. Thanks to OrthoWorx CEO Bob Vitoux for our conversation today. To learn more about other leaders on IBJ Media's Indiana 250 list, go to indiana250.com and look for a Page 2 feature each week in IBJ. We'll be back with a new Indiana 250 off-the-record conversation soon.